Stop me if you've heard this one before. You're working on your game, and all of a sudden your house gets struck by lightning, and since your computer is plugged into a wall outlet, everything explodes, and you've lost everything. There are a few takeaways from that. One is that you really shouldn't plug your computer into a wall outlet. You should use a surge protector, or better yet, a UPS device. And two, you really need to back up your work. If you do anything with a computer, game design, video production, anything. So when that happens, you might say, okay, let's go to GameMaker, File, Export Project, and let's say, let's call it Source Control Tutorial Backup. And it creates one of these things down here. Source Control Tutorial Backup.yyz. You can do it in GameMaker Studio 1 as well. And then you throw the file on an external hard drive, or Google Drive, or Mediafire, or if anyone besides me still uses that, or something else. Dropbox, whatever. And everything's fine and dandy again. Next, stop me if you've heard this one before. You keep working on your game, and let's say it's going pretty well. You've got a nice cool level with a pirate ship in the middle of it or something. And then one day you decide to make a change to something, and all of a sudden, everything is terrible. That's exactly what I want my game to look like, thanks. And so, fortunately, you've got yourself a backup. If I were to spawn off a new IDE again, one of these days. Thank you, GameMaker. And it will, you will go to the import button, and you will select Source Control Tutorial Backup, or whatever you decided to call it. It will ask you to save the backup file in a new location. You run the game again, and oh no, it's broken in the backup too. So the next logical step, I'm going to close out of that. The next logical step is to create a series of backups. Let's go to Export Project. You could call this Source Control Tutorial Backup 1, 2, 3, whatever. I usually call it something by the date. Usually in descending order to make them easier to find when you sort by name in Windows Explorer. 2020, February 18th. So, okay. Let's say you create a backup every night when you finish working on your code. And you probably want to save them in a central location. Which is fine until one day you go look into your folder of backups, and if I can find it in deep storage. Holy crap, that's a lot of backup files. How am I even supposed to use this? Do you have to just open up every single one until you can find the version with the last version with working code or something? That's gonna take forever. In case anyone's wondering, this is about 160 files between the beginning of 2020 and about September, before I learned what source control was. If you add it all up, I think it's about 1.5 gigabytes. Fun stuff. Fortunately, the world of computer science has a solution to this, and I just said it. If you're looking at the title of the video, you may be guessing that it's called source control. And source control will go and solve both of those problems. It'll solve all three problems too if you're concerned about the amount of space that manually creating a backup will. Also, an aside, because I want to remember to mention this because it's important. The solution that a lot of people come up with to solve this problem is to save the GameMaker project directly in a Dropbox folder or some other shared folder like Google Drive or OneDrive or whatever. Don't do this. This is a terrible idea. I'm sorry if it makes it sound like I'm making fun of people who do this, but it's a terrible idea. The way shared folders work, if they try and sync their files at the same time that GameMaker is saving to them, there's a good chance that your project will become corrupted because you suddenly have a jumbled mess of some old files and some new files, and GameMaker doesn't know what to do with it. About once a week, someone will post on the GameMaker Reddit or Discord or Yo-Yo Games forums because they had their project saved in Dropbox and all of a sudden it's corrupted. Unfortunately, more often than not, the answer is no unless you have a backup somewhere else. The solution is to not do that. Use source control. So on a happier note, how to do that, there are a couple ways to set up source control. So if you're in GameMaker, and this GameMaker Studio 1 does have source control integration as well, the way you would set it up is slightly different. In GameMaker, go to Options, go to Main over here. Down here, about halfway down, there's a button that says Enable Source Control. Click Apply, okay. A new menu has popped up in the top of the window, and there are a few options that say Create Project Repository, Import Project into Repository, Clone Repository. The first thing that you want to do is to go back into options, uncheck enable source control, click OK, the menu will disappear, and find another solution. I'm sorry, that was my half-hearted attempt at comedy. GameMaker Studio 2 source control isn't the absolute worst thing ever. It used to be a lot worse, but the general consensus is still that you want to use a separate source control client, whether that be GitHub Desktop. Git for the command line. Every time I shake a window like that, Windows automatically minimizes everything. Thank you. Windows 10. I wonder if I can disable it from doing that. I'd like to. I do that without paying attention a lot.
Hey.
So you have things like GitHub Desktop. You have the command line. If you know how to use command line Git. I have a soft spot for the command line, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video. You can do some cool things with it, but I don't want to scare anyone off of source control because it's important and everyone should use it. So some ground rules. Some of you may know this. I just want to get them squared away. Git and GitHub are not the same thing. Git itself is a tool for source control, and GitHub is a website that is a host for various code repositories that you would create using source control. It's basically, and saying this makes me die a little bit inside, it's basically cloud storage for source control. There are other tools you can use for source control. Git is just one of the more popular ones, due in no small part to the fact that it's free.
Hey.
Other ones that you may have heard of: Perforce, SVN, CVS, which is ancient, and you probably don't want to use. This program that I have open right here in front of me, GitHub Desktop, this is a user interface for Git. The actual tool is more close to something that you would see on the command line. If I were to open one up, it's a command line tool. You can do a lot of things with it, and GitHub Desktop just provides a nice user interface for it. So to obtain either Git or GitHub Desktop, you can just type GitHub Desktop into your preferred search engine, and it'll take you to this website, the first result, and you can download it and run the installer. Windows or Mac, whatever you happen to be using. If all you want is Git, if you just want to use it on the command line, Git source control should do it instead. That will take you to the actual website where, again, you can download it, run the installer, Windows or Mac. If you happen to be someone who's using Linux, I'm guessing you already know all of this. I have been using this for a while, so I have a list of repositories already set up. To create a new one, you go to File up here. There's a couple options: New Repository, Add Local, which is if there's one that already exists on your computer that you want to use, and Clone, which is if there's one on the internet that you want to access. I'm going to say New. Enter a repository name. Source control. You don't have to enter a description, but it's pretty nice. The local path. GitHub Desktop will create a folder called source control in the folder that you select.
Hey.
Creating a repository in a folder that already contains stuff in GitHub Desktop is a bit of a pain, so I'll just create a new one. It will be called source control up here. Next, you have the option to initialize this repository with a readme, which is just a text, or more correctly, a markdown file with instructions for anyone who stumbles across the repository and wants to know anything about it, what it's for, how to use it, anything like that. Git ignore is if you want to exclude files from the repository. That's not too important. Other programming languages have a defined git ignore for files that you don't need to include that you can choose. Unity, Unreal, other Godot, other game engines. GameMaker doesn't have one. You don't have to worry about that. License, if you're interested in open source software, you know what to do with this. MIT, GNU, Apache license, those are the most common ones. If you want to add a license, MIT is probably fine. I'm just going to leave it with none right now. And then create repository. So this is going to create a folder. And if I go back to, let's see, GameMaker, that's the wrong GameMaker folder because I have two GameMaker folders. I'm just going to open this in Explorer. Open this folder in Explorer. This is inside my GameMaker Studio 2 main folder. Like I said, it created a new one called source control, and it contains a hidden folder called .git, a text file called .git attributes, which is not important to us right now, and a readme.md, which is the markdown file that I mentioned as a well, a readme file. If you don't see the hidden folder called .git, that's because you have hidden folders invisible on your computer. I highly suggest turning those on, not just for using source control, but for general purpose. I think there's a lot to be said for actually knowing what's on your computer and not hidden from view. So when you're done with that, I'm going to close the GameMaker IDE, and I'm going to drag the project folder that I was just looking in, source control tutorial. I'm going to just drag that file, copy paste whatever into the repository, and now you can see in the background. Oops, you can see in the background. There's a whole list of files that are marked as changed. So what source control does, and I should describe this sooner rather than later, is it keeps track of changes in your project. And you'll see more about how that exactly works later. But for the time being, I added a bunch of files that were inside the GameMaker project file, and they showed up in GitHub Desktop marked as newly created. So to save these changes, or to use the source control term to commit the changes, which is essentially about saving a snapshot of your project, you need to enter a description. You can make this whatever you want. You could keyboard mash if you don't feel like typing a description. For your own sake, please don't do that, because if you ever need to go back in your commit history to find something, and all of your commit messages are just keyboard mashing, it will be very hard to find what you're looking for. It's traditional when you first create the repository to say initial commit. Since I added a bunch of files, I'm just going to type added a bunch of files. And if you want, you can add a longer description. It's generally a good idea to keep the commit messages short and easy to read and descriptive. In practice, not all of them will be. That's a project management issue more than a technical one, though. When you're done, commit to master, and it will take a moment. And once it's done with that, you can duck on over to the history tab, and you can see there are two entries. One added a bunch of files. This is what I did. You can see in the list over here in the middle, this is all the files that were added or changed later on when you start changing things. And below that, the initial commit, where the repository was initially created. I mentioned that earlier. The next thing that you probably want to do, that has created a backup on your local machine. If you change something and suddenly your game stops working, you can poke through the commit history and try and track down where that might have happened. I will talk about that more later. But it's still only on your machine. It's not on a backup server like GitHub or anything. So to do that, next to this thing that says current branch master, which is not important for us right now, we'll talk about that later as well. There's a publish repository button, and this is pretty easy. We will call this source control. For the most part, all of these settings that will automatically be filled in here are okay. If you want your code to be public, you may or may not want to. You can uncheck the keep code private button. I personally want my code to be public because I'm making a tutorial, and that's kind of the point. Organization, this thing here, don't worry about that. So I'm going to click publish repository. If you aren't logged in to a GitHub account, it will ask you to. You can use Git itself without being logged in. GitHub, I did it again. GitHub will ask you to be logged in. Can I? Okay, so I can wiggle the I can wiggle the window around to recover my desktop if I ever do that by accident. Good to know. If you have a GitHub account, you'll want to log in. If you don't have a GitHub account, you'll want to create one. There are free accounts on GitHub. You can pay for them. The free accounts are fine for almost all purposes. It also bears mentioning that there are other online hosts for source code repositories. Bitbucket and GitLab come to mind. If you prefer one of those, you can use them. I don't know if they have their own user interface clients or not. GitHub Desktop obviously is made specifically to work with GitHub. Anyway, once you've got all that set up, you can just hit click, publish repository, and it will do that. And I am going to go over to my GitHub account, go over here to repositories, source control. This is the one I just created 12 seconds ago. And here we have everything. We have the project files. I'm not going to go through all of them. If you go over here to commits, you can see there are both of the commits that I created. If I were to click on one, you can see the details, and it will take a moment, and it will show all the files that have been added or changed, if you have any changed files. 20,000 additions. Dang. Most of those are in meta files, not actual code.
Hey.
So I'm going to bring that back off to the side. I'm going to come back here. This is not my tutorial project. I need to open my tutorial project. Where is it? Source control, that is the repository. Source control tutorial, that is the GameMaker project. And here we go. So let's say I change something. Let me go to game object, and as with the last couple things that I've made, this is just the last tutorial that I was working on for 3D purposes. Don't be scared by the 3D-ness. This obviously can be used for anything that you want to put on source control. It doesn't even have to be GameMaker. It doesn't even have to be game dev. It doesn't even have to be computer programming. If you really want to, you could use this to back up versions of your English homework or essays or whatever, putting all of your homework on the internet like that, but whatever.
Hey.
Let's say I don't want the ship to be spazzing out the way it was, so I will delete the transformation code that makes it do that. And let's run the game again, just so that we can see that there are indeed changes. Which isn't even integral to the source control tutorial. I just want to show you that's what happens. It stops spazzing out. That's cool. And if I come back over to the GitHub desktop client, you can see that there is a change that has showed up. This one is marked with a yellow dot. Thank you. This one is marked with a yellow dot instead of a green plus to indicate that it's been changed instead of created. If you create a file, it'll be marked as a green plus. If you change a file, it'll be a yellow dot. And if you remove a file, it will be a red minus. And over here on the side, you can see the exact changes that have happened. The way Git works internally and other source control programs is that it only keeps track of changes rather than creating a backup of your whole project every single time. You, as the game designer, don't necessarily need to know how Git works under the hood, but in case you were wondering, that's essentially the solution to the third problem that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, where keeping a load of manual backups will start to consume a lot of storage space. Since Git only keeps track of changes, it has a very light storage footprint. Unless you're messing with a lot of binary files, which could be a slightly different story, but I won't talk about that for now. So I'm going to add another commit message that says, how about, what did I do? I made the ship stop spazzing out is what I did. So we will commit to master. Master has to do with the current branch that you're on. That is mostly a thing that will be important if you're working on a team with people. If you're just working on your own, you don't really need to worry about it, although you can if you want to. I'm going to come over to the history tab. You can see that a third entry has shown up in the list of commits, and it has the change that I made. That's good. Let's make another change. I don't especially have anything in mind that I want to work with. I want to change a different file than the game object draw event. I want to change a different piece of code. Just for the sake of doing so, let us make the field of view a little bit wider. Let's make the field of view, how about 60 instead of 45? That should be noticeable, right? I think that should be noticeable. Alright, that's definitely noticeable. The field of view is quite a bit wider. So that's something. I will commit this change as well. Let's say increased field of view. And as before, there's another entry in the commit log over here in the history tab. And I'm going to make one more change before I go back to talking about source control. I just want to have a couple of commits in the log. I just want to have a couple changes that I can use to demonstrate various things. Let's make the ship completely invisible. Maybe we've decided we don't want the pirate ship at all, in which case the easy solution would just be to remove it outright, but I want to go back to to one of the files I've already messed with, so I can demonstrate some things later. We made the ship invisible. Okay. And here it is in the log. So the first thing that is that I think is important to mention is that when you just click the commit button, when you click the big blue commit button, which actually isn't that big, when you click the small blue commit button, that only logs the changes on your local machine, on your local repository. If you were to go back to, I have 2 windows open for this apparently. All right, that's an old attempt at the tutorial where the recording didn't work, so I had to do it again. The more you know. If I refresh the page over here, the last commitment was made 12 minutes ago, and I know I cut a lot of time out of these tutorial videos because sometimes I want to re-record something because I don't think I said it properly the first time, but 12 minutes is a bit much. You can see that there are still only 2 commits in this repository on github.com. They only go up to added a bunch of files. If I were to poke through the code, you would see that the changes that I made are not there. To mirror out the changes from your local computer to the online repository, you need to keep pushing the push origin button, clicking the push origin button every time you make a change. If you don't, a little reminder will show up here on the side, as well as in your list of repositories. If you have more than one, it will have a little icon that shows that there are either commits to be files to be committed, changes to be pushed out to the remote, or both, as you can see there. And now if I were to come back here, the repository has 5 commits: made ship invisible, increased field of view, made the ship stop spazzing out, added a bunch of files into initial commit. And if I were to look through the code, which I'm not going to do right now, you would see that it's updated. Last commit made 2 minutes ago. That sounds a lot better. So because I want to talk about some of the problems that I mentioned at the beginning of the video with source control that you can solve, if, for example, you find your code broken and you want to know when that happened and you want to preferably try to fix it, you can see as I click on each of these entries in the commit history, you can see there are a list of files that have been changed, as well as what specifically has been changed inside them. This is a lot easier than manually loading backups constantly until you find a working version. You can see what code has been changed, and if you want to revert to a specific point, let's say that I want my ship to start spazzing out again, and I have deleted the code that does that. All I have to do is right-click, revert to this commit. It's going to process for a second, and it has undone that change. So another entry has shown up in the commit log, an automatic one, which says reverted, making the ship stop spazzing out. If I were to click on it, you can see that it has re-added the deleted lines and deleted the one that I changed. Git doesn't actually recognize individual lines as being changed. If you change a line, it will instead mark it as removed and replaced with something else. And I can come back to GameMaker, and if I wait a second, it will pop up a message saying project directory modified, because GameMaker will scan your project folder for changes periodically every couple of seconds. Would you like to reload the resources or save? This message can pop up for a couple different reasons. If you change something inside your project folder manually, it will pop up. If you did that by accident, you probably want to click save and proceed as normal. If you're using source control and you want to revert changes, you more likely will want to click reload instead. And you can see once I do that, the code that I deleted earlier is gone. is back. You will also notice that nothing else has been changed. So the other change that I made to the script, interestingly enough, is still here. This line that's commented out, that's still here. And if I were to come down here to the camera, where the field of view is defined, you will see that that is still 60 and has not been changed to 45. If you wanted to undo one of those as well, you could either manually uncomment it, because it's only 1 line of code and 2 characters, and that's easy. Or if you want source control to do it, you could revert this commit as well. And if we wait a couple seconds, GameMaker will ask us to reload. We can say yes, and that line is no longer commented out. Which I realize is a rather trivial example, because again, it's just 2 added slashes at the beginning of a line. But you can do whatever you want with that. If we bring back the game, we can see that the ship is back and it's doing whatever the heck it was doing before. Another thing you can do with source control is let's say you're working on something. I'm going to go into the movement code, which is over here. This should look somewhat familiar, even if you're not used to doing 3D. Let's say that I make a bunch of changes. I don't really care what they are, as long as they're not going to work. I'm just going to change a bunch of numbers to something completely arbitrary and rather different. I have no idea what any of these mean. And that's going to make movement behave very weirdly indeed. Oh my god, okay, yeah. I don't think the game is supposed to do that. So you could Control Z that if you just made the changes now, and it would be fine. But say, for example, you've saved and closed the window. And let's, for good measure, close that window too, even though it won't have any effect. And let's say you come back 20 minutes later after you go eat lunch or something, and you realize, holy crap, I messed with all this code and I wasn't supposed to, and it suddenly doesn't work and it makes me fly off into the distance. If you haven't committed your changes, if you go over to source control, you can still recover that, even if you haven't committed changes. You would just go and reset all the files that you want. You could use discard changes if you're in GitHub for the command. What? I accidentally clicked ignore file by adding to git ignore. I don't want that. That's kind of the opposite of what I did. Which is another thing you can do if you want. Just not in my case. Discard changes. If you're working on the command line, there's a couple other options that you can use to revert changes. I'm just going to say yes, please. Thanks for asking. And if I were to come back to GameMaker, once again, would you like to reload the project? And everything is back to normal. That's the basics of source control. You keep a history of your changes. You back it up to a remote location just in case something happens to your computer, your hard drive dies or something. Is probably a slightly more realistic situation than your computer getting struck by lightning. If you have a mechanical hard drive anyway. Now, if you want to take the project that's on a remote repository, I'm just going to push the changes out to the origin so that they're all there in a minute. Let me go over here. And actually, hang on. I'm going to close GameMaker first. I am going to file repository, remove this repository, and we'll delete it from my computer as well. To make it easier to show what's going on later, what I'm going to do in a minute. If you come over to the repository page in GitHub, and once again, if you're using Bitbucket or something else, the interface will be slightly different, but all the tools should still be there. Go to the big green clone or download button. You have the option to download a zip, which is literally just putting all this in a zip file and downloading it onto your computer, which you can do, but if you want to use source control, that's not really recommended. You can copy the URL, and you can do whatever you want with that in either the command line or some other source control tool. Or you can click the Open in Desktop button. And that's going to pop up asking if you want to open GitHub desktop.exe, which is this program here, as you probably have realized. This is the menu for cloning a repository. If you want to file and clone repository, it would be the same thing, but with some of the properties already filled in for you. Everything is fine. This is the local path where the repository is going to be created on your computer. You could select a different one if you want. I'm just going to say clone. And that will take a few seconds. And if you go into history, you see everything is here. All of the changes that I've made, everything. And if you were to go into, to the location on your computer where that was cloned, you would see that it just happened. I should have shown that this file was deleted a minute ago before I cloned it, but oh well. You can see date modified 4:40 p.m. on today. Same date is on my computer down here right now. That's not important. So there are some other things you can do with Git. There are a lot of other things you can do with Git. In fact, there's even a bunch of other things you can do with GitHub Desktop that I haven't talked about, which I'm not going to because I just want this to be an overview video and not anything super advanced. I mentioned branches earlier, but to be honest, I actually don't want to get into that now. That could go on for a little while. I suppose it's worth mentioning if you clone a repository, if you're already logged into GitHub, you could choose one of the repositories you already have created, and just clone it like that without having to grab the URL. I may make another video in the future on more advanced things you can do with source control. We'll see. For now, my name is Dragonite. This has been How to Source Control with a slight GameMaker angle. Again, you could use this for anything. I'm not going to have a download in the description of this video. Instead, I'm going to have a link to this page because it's kind of the point of the tutorial. In the future, I might still have links to download the projects, the YYZ compressed project files for future tutorials. Although, to be honest, I would like to kind of I would like to encourage this whole source control thing, so I might just switch over to that. That's enough. My name is Dragonite. I hope you all found this useful. Please use source control in your projects. It's always good to have backups and all the other nice things I mentioned. I will see you all later.